I've noticed that not a lot of people make sourdough, and I think it's because a lot of people are either intimidated by the idea of taking care of a starter, or they've tried and had one die. I'm here to help you work these things out and show you that it's really not that hard. Let's start with containers. So when you're choosing your container, you want to follow two simple rules with a couple of side notes. Rule number one, you want to make sure that it's not metal. If you put it in a metal container, your sourdough starter is acidic by nature, and it's going to break down the metal and it'll start leaching into your sourdough starter and it's going to ruin it. Rule number two, you need to be breathable. This will help you avoid a yeast bomb in your kitchen, and it's also important that your starter has the oxygen it needs to do its thing. The most important part of taking care of your starter is going to be feeding it. This is done by removing a portion of the starter and then adding in a portion of flour and water to give your yeast something to feed on. Now, if you read online, this can seem like a pretty complicated thing. There's a lot of very specific instructions on there that can vary from site to site, but it's really not that difficult. You can keep your starter as thick or thin as you want it, as long as you're feeding it consistently. The orthodoxy will say to feed it at a 1:1:1 ratio, and that's going to be 1 part starter to 1 part flour to 1 part water. Some people do it by weight, some people like to do it by volume. I like to keep my starter at a kind of a thick pancake batter consistency, but the thing you want to keep in mind is the thicker your starter is, the stronger the taste is going to be. The thinner it is, the more mild it's going to be. Now, as far as the side notes go, it's more convenient to have a wider mouth on your jar or whatever you're keeping in. I use a Costco jam jar that we used up, and I've just recycled it. And I put the lid on, I screwed the lid on lightly so that it doesn't seal the jar. You also want to make sure that your starter has enough room to rise. So when you feed it, it's going to at least double, if not triple in size. Make sure that whatever amount of starter you're keeping in there has enough room to grow. Now, as far as the process of feeding the starter goes, generally what I'll do is I'll just remove half of my starter and I'll add half a cup to a cup of flour into it, and then an equal amount in volume of water. And that gives me that thick pancake batter consistency. Then you simply just stir it up. You can let it sit on the counter for a couple hours and it'll kind of activate the yeast. But honestly, for a long time, I was just putting it directly in the fridge and it didn't seem to be a problem. It never really had any negative impacts on my bread. As far as feeding frequency goes, it's really going to depend on where you're keeping your starter. Now, for practicality reasons, I'm going to talk about the main two places that people who actually use their starter are keeping it. You're really either going to be keeping it on your counter or you're going to be keeping it in your fridge. Where you keep it is going to depend on how much bread you bake. It'll also determine how often you feed your starter. So if you're keeping it on the counter, you're going to want to feed it a minimum of once a day. Ideally, you're going to feed it twice a day. That'll guarantee a healthy starter every time. And in the fridge, you're going to feed it a minimum of once a week and ideally twice a week. If you're feeding it twice a week, your starter will never go bad. The yeast in the starter has its own immune system. It creates an acidic environment that's not friendly to bacteria, and as long as it's alive, it'll never get moldy. Now, if your starter is starving, it'll produce a liquid called hooch. That's just alcohol on the top of your starter that you can either dump off or stir into your starter. And it's not really an issue. It just is a sign that you need to feed your starter more often. After a few feedings, you might notice that there's a little bit of crust developing around the top of your jar. You can just scrape that right off back into your starter. It's not a big deal. It's not anything to be concerned about. It's not going to make you sick. Now, when you're ready to use your starter, ideally what you want to do is feed it the night before if you're going to use it in the morning, and use it right as that starter has peaked on its rise, just as it's about to fall. But to be honest, I've even used it without feeding it before, and my bread turned out fine. It might have taken a little bit longer to rise, but I ended up with good bread anyways. If you're not a chef and you don't need to worry about making perfect, consistent loaves, then it's fine either way. But you do need to feed it to keep it alive. Now, what kind of flour do you feed your starter? The truth is you can feed it whatever flour you want as long as it's got the starches necessary to feed your yeast. Some people have expressed concerns about bleach flour. Bleach flour is fine as long as you're not using it to make your starter. The yeast in bleach flour has all been killed, but the chemicals are no longer there to kill the yeast that you've already created. Personally, I just use the fresh ground red wheat flour that I make here in my kitchen, and it's been working great. One thing that you will notice is that if you're using a white flour or a refined flour, something that's more easily broken down by the yeast, it's going to rise faster and it'll be consumed more quickly by the yeast in your starter. Now, just like people, starters can get sick. If your starter is not rising to double or triple the size like it normally does, then you've probably got a sick starter. You might also notice kind of like a different smell in your starter. These are both signs that your starter is not doing well. And to solve this problem, really all you've got to do is feed your starter a few times. What you can do is you can keep it out of the fridge, you can do the twice a day feedings for a couple of days, and your starter should go back to normal. Now, in the off chance that this doesn't work, I have seen that some people like to use pineapple juice. They'll add a tablespoon of pineapple juice to their starter as they're feeding, and this will increase the acidity of the starter to help fight other bacteria, and it also provides some extra sugar for the yeast to feed on. If you're going out of town, you've got several options to make sure that your starter is cared for. One, you can ask a friend to take care of it and feed it like it's your pet. Two, if you're only going away for a week or two, you can leave it in your fridge and just let it get sick and come back and feed it. Three, you can put it in your freezer and that'll last you for up to a month. And your fourth option is to spread some of it out on like a piece of wax paper or a silicone baking sheet, and you can make some starter flakes. You spread the starter on there, let it sit for about 24 to 48 hours, and once it's dry, those flakes will pop off nice and easy. You put them in a plastic bag, you put them in your fridge, and over 3 or 4 feedings, you can bring those flakes back to life. I hope this video was useful for you. When I first got my starter, it was a little bit intimidating trying to figure out how to make it and how to take care of it. But like I said, it's really not that hard. Just pay attention to what it's doing, and if it looks like it needs food, then feed it. Good luck on your sourdough journeys, and I'll see you next time.